In this video, I want to talk about new networks of schools that are emerging that I find to be really fascinating. And I think it's important for us to think about as we think about what's the next step for our schools, both in Kentucky and nationally and internationally, as schools continue to evolve and develop. And I want to focus in on 4 networks in particular, with 2 of those being the focus of my talk today. And those 4 different types of networks that I see existing in the world that are impacting how we think about these questions are professional networks, digital networks, platforms, and school networks. So professional networks, let's start there because that's easy peasy. Of course, remember NextGen is a professional network, and when you look at what we do at NextGen, the very first thing that we ask leaders to do is to network together. First thing, network leaders, focus on transformation, start with cultural change toward innovation, deep background in next-gen learning, lots of examples, identifying entry points, specific projects, implement with fidelity as broad gateways to reform. That particular model has worked really well for us in NextGen over the last 7 years, but it always starts right up there at the top in the intentional networking that we do as the Next Generation Leadership Network. And you see that then unfolding across the state. So as you see things like Marshall County, Shelby County, Mason County, all developing profiles of their graduates, you're seeing lots of commonality. Of course, there's uniqueness to each district, but there's tons of commonality because these professional networks are working together to develop the next generation of learning systems together. Okay, great. So now let's just shift briefly to digital networks. And I want to start with the digital network and remind you that there was a time out there before the internet. I know, hard to imagine for many of you watching this video. Perhaps you've lived your entire life while the internet has existed, but there were computers before the internet. They looked a little bit like this. Kids were using them. And what did we do on computers before the network? Well, like we had pinball and Minesweeper and solitaire, like in between word processing, we would play these games because we had nothing else to do. That's all you could do because there was no network. So when you ask the question of what is the internet, we're not going to watch this entire video, but it's a great video if you ever want to go and check out, like, how did this internet thing happen and what exactly is it?
What is the internet?
The internet is like a popular thing.
Some satellites up there.
I picture in my head with like waves of internet going to the phone.
Somebody told me a cloud once.
The internet is a lot like plumbing. It's always moving.
Most people don't have any idea where the internet came from, and it doesn't matter. They don't need to. It's sort of like asking who invented the ballpoint pen or the flush toilet or, the zipper. These are all things we just use every day, and we don't even think about the fact that one day somebody invented them. So the internet is just like that. Many, many years ago, in the early 1970s, my partner Bob Kahn and I began working on the design of what we now call the internet. It was a result of another experiment called the ARPANET, which stood for Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. It was a Defense Department research project. Paul Barron was trying to figure out how to build a communication system that might actually survive a nuclear attack. So he had this idea of breaking messages up into blocks and sending them as fast as possible in every possible direction through the mesh network.
Okay, fine. So there you go. There's a little bit of the very foundational points of the internet. As ARPANET developed, this is what ARPANET looked like in 1982 and all the different nodes on that network, points that were interacting. You can see for us here in Kentucky in 1982, there were no points on the internet in 1982. The internet did not exist for us in Kentucky at that time period. That original sort of layout relied on a distributed network, and it looked like this. Now, this is interesting to me, this particular map, because what does an early network look like across the United States? Well, that map looks a lot to me like maps I'm going to show you in just a bit. Remember, schools are operating systems for me, and you can read more about that on my blog at Recode School if you want to really understand how schools and technologies to me are the same thing. But as I think about school, I think about a technology, and that means I'm thinking about school not completely unlike I'm thinking about school, the computers before the internet. I think we're in a period of school before networks. And So each school is largely trying to function on its own hardware, at its own little institution. And that's a really hard thing to do. When you're trying to run this entire operation from just one point with just a small team, there's just not a lot to do at the school. And so what does it look like, school before the internet? I think it looks a little bit like this. It looks like textbooks and worksheets and trapper keepers and various sort of technological tools that we had, mimeographs or overhead projectors, those kinds of things. I think that is what school before the internet and before networking looks and feels like. Now, of course, if you look at most schools around Kentucky and most schools around the world, they still very much resemble school before the internet. Here in Kentucky, I tell people we're operating school OS 1.990 because that's the last time we did a major upgrade to our system of schools. It was in 1990. We've been running that same system now for a while, and we haven't done a substantial upgrade since then. And I think it's time for us to sort of think about what that might be. Remember, this is our current networking of schools, in that each little district, each little geographic box that you see on the map in Kentucky is its own school district, and each one of those is trying to run its own whole system in a given location. Sometimes those districts work together. So one way to do some networking of districts together is geographically. So this is the special ed service regions in Kentucky. These districts work together to do some special education projects together. And you can see a geographic alignment with each other. But what if, instead of geography, we could network based on shared values? Now that to me is quite different and interesting and requires us to sort of take a pause and think about that question. What if instead of geography, we could network based on shared values? Now, I always like looking backwards in time, and the person who I think first understood this concept most deeply and led us in this direction was a guy named Ted Sizer. He worked at Harvard and Brown, but he built this thing called the Coalition of Essential Schools. And they had these 9 sort of foundational principles that they all shared. And you could apply to become a member of the Coalition for Essential Schools network. And if you did that, then you were agreeing to become a network school and operate based on these shared values. And suddenly the importance of the network became the other schools in the coalition, not so much the school that is next door to you. So when you look at the coalition and how that unfolded, the coalition has now closed shop, but many networks are replacing it. This was the coalition schools. When I look at that map, I think of this map. To me, these two are not unlike each other. This particular layout of Coalition of Essential Schools and ARPANET in 1982, those two feel very similar to me. Now, this is a current network. This is the Summit Learning Network and its distribution. We're going to talk about schools and platforms in just a bit, but as this new network of schools has rolled out, you can see there's lots of dots all over the map. And again, this to me feels like a burgeoning network, just like ARPANET. You can then look inside of a state. There are new networks inside of states, like so the Ohio STEM Learning Network is all these different schools across the state that are all working together within a single network based on shared values. And of course, for us in NextGen, we have all these NextGen districts across the state of Kentucky and many more now because we're in year 7. But as we have rolled out our network, there's been a lot of districts that have jumped in. All of these schools are now networked together. And it leads us to this question of what is happening here. Are we thinking about a re-networking of schools based off of shared values rather than geographical proximity? So, new networks of curriculum development, new networks of professional development, new networks of resource sharing, of schooling, and of learning. These new networks are emerging presently. I want to show you 2 components of that by focusing in on school networks and platforms. First, school networks. So, deeper learning networks of schools are emerging all over the country. This particular graphic shows a bunch of deeper learning networks from Asia Society, Big Picture, ConnectEd, EdVisions, Expeditionary, High Tech High, International Schools, the New Tech Network, which is a very large one, and it doesn't even include Summit, which of course is now very rapidly become the largest network. All of these different players have multiple schools based off of shared values. And of course, one that we love here deeply in Kentucky is Envision Learning Partners. We feature them a lot at NextGen. We love Summit Learning. We like the New Tech. Of course, there's only one New Tech in Kentucky right now. There's only one big picture school in Kentucky right now, but I think more are coming. So let's then shift and talk quickly about platforms as an extension of these networks, because one of the key things that these networks do is provide a platform for schools to all operate on simultaneously, so that a teacher in one location and a teacher in 3 US states over can be working on shared work at the same time and sharing their different curriculum models and that kind of stuff. So when you look at the Summit Learning platform, that particular platform is supporting the network by realigning what is going on in school, how time is being spent in school, how is the student-teacher relationship being defined in school. All of this is being redefined by the Summit Learning platform or the New Tech Learning Management System. And so it starts to change a whole bunch of what we actually think school is. And for schools that are in this network, that are working on these different platforms, the relationships that are most important to them in terms of how they operate school are not the school next door or the school 4 counties over. It is, hey, that school in New Mexico that's doing this thing that really fits us well, they're networking together. Geography is really fading away as a definer of networks, and really what is replacing it is values and relevance. And of course, this is the Summit Network picture again, and so we can see there's lots of dots on that Summit Network in Kentucky, and those are going to continue to roll out, but we also have lots of dots in Arkansas, up in the Chicago region, California, in the Northeast. This network is really beginning to tie together and have those shared values and be the more important network to a Summit school than the geographic networks in a state. That's a lot to cover, I know, in this short video. What I hope you take away from this video is we are changing the definition of networks across these different domains, from professional to digital to school networks to platforms. These are all shifting presently, and your school, if you're currently just only based in your geographic network, I think you're probably missing out at this point. You should go out and check out the Summit Learning Network, the New Tech Network, Big Picture Schools. If you're international, the Asia Society, or other international networks out there. There are new models emerging for how to get us the help that we need to run a school in a given location across digital platforms and all the different professional networks. I think that is going to help define what the future feels like for us in school and take us a big step forward as we think about sort of the historical development of schooling, in the same way that the internet has taken a big step forward in how we think about communication.